Order. Good morning everyone and welcome to the Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee. I'm Florence Eshalomi, I'm the chair of the committee. Can I ask committee members just to introduce themselves please?
I'm Mary Ellis, MP for Ribble Valley.
I'm Chris Curtis, Labour MP for Milton Keynes North.
Andrew Lewin, MP for Welwyn Hatfield.
Shaba Khan, Labour MP for Gillingham and Rainham.
Joe Powell, MP for Kensington and Bayswater.
Will Forster, MP for Woking.
Sarah Smith, Labour MP for Hyndburn.
Will Forster, MP for Woking. Yeah.
I bet MP for Sheffield South East and guesting on behalf of the Public Accounts Committee.
Lee Dillon, MP for Newbury.
Jagan Mahindra, Conservative Member Parliament for South West Hertfordshire.
We've had apologies from Lewis Cochrane, MP for Broxbourne. Minister and Nick, can I ask you to introduce yourselves for the Hansard please?
I'm Jim McMahon, I'm the Minister of State covering local government and English devolution.
And I'm Nico Heslop and I'm Director of Local Government Finance in the Department of Housing and Local Government.
Thank you for joining us both. We are having our overnight session this morning with you just to discuss the funding and sustainability of local government finance. We've had a number of meetings, we've received a number of written evidence over the last few months, and this morning it's just to get your take on some of the issues that we've heard over the last few weeks. We've got quite a number of detailed questions, so I'm going to ask committee members to be quite brief, and equally if you could be quite brief in your reply as well so that we can get the most from this meeting. Now, Minister, we know that local authorities across England provide so many services, in essence over 800 services, most of which are mandatory services. They range from adult social care, children's services, waste collections, planning, housing services. And the data from a number of big organisations, including the LGA, Institute for Finance, IFG, are saying that social care, children's social care, SEND and temporary housing are causing big pressures on local government. Minister, what is local government for?
Well, I mean, first of all, completely recognise all of those pressures, and they are pressures that we are alive to. One, in terms of dealing with the underlying causes that are leading to those pressures, and secondly, to support local government to bridge to what will be a more sustainable footing. There is no doubt that the impact on rocketing demand in adult social care, in children's services, in temporary accommodation, and almost the decoupling of neighbourhood services has led to a crisis in local government, where the cost of meeting those people-led targeted services is increasing at a rate of knots in a way that many councils are finding unsustainable. And at the same time, neighbourhood universal services that most people rely on, that give quality of life, that give people security and pride of place, have absolutely been affected over the last decade, and people feel that in the places where they live. And so our job is to rebuild the foundations. And it's fair to say that the inheritance is challenging. The fiscal inheritance is challenging, but also actually the structural inheritance is challenging. If we think about the audit backlog, we had over 900 sets of accounts that weren't submitted to us. That meant that we didn't have a real test of where money was in the system and where some of the pressure points were in the system. It also meant, in large part, that the early warning system that would give us a heads up as to problems coming our way just wasn't fit for purpose. We had Offlog that in part did a good job in terms of data, but massively underdeveloped and didn't have a clearly defined role. We weren't delivering under the previous government multi-year settlements, so councils were going from one year to the next, not knowing how much money they would have coming in to fund local public services. The standards regime, I think in most parts of the country, has been shattered. Councillors, by and large, do a good job. They are good public servants, but they expect that the standards regime will kick in when people misbehave and don't apply the same standards. I would say in too many councils that has been absent, and as a result, that is the consequence of a standards regime that just hasn't been fit for purpose. And then there is the underlying needs and resources assessment of what the government perceives a council needs versus what a council can generate from local taxation, and then what the government's role is in terms of the equaliser to the system.
Do you think on that then, is the role of local authorities to do what central government requires of them, or do they have that democratic decision-making role over their activities and service? And going back to my initial question, what is the role of local government? What do you see as our council's day-to-day functions?
Well, you see, in a way it's both, isn't it? They are the delivery arm of government, they are on the ground, they are in communities, and they are marshalling frontline workers to deal with the social and economic challenges that the country faces. They're also, I think, the part of government that can unleash community potential whether that's about early intervention and prevention, whether it's about looking at whole community responses to public services. That is what good public services look like. But equally, there will be local variation where they take a view of their local area and they'll decide that there are particular services or particular emphasis needed in those areas, and we should allow for that variance and that democratic variance, provided for the fact that there isn't a postcode lottery as to whether people get essential services that every community should get as a baseline.
Because one of the questions that keeps coming up is around the increase in demand that local government is having to take. Essentially, you turn up at your council's front desk, the range of different services that a constituent member of the public could ask for has increased over the many years. So do you think that it may be a time, it may be a need for government to now reassess council's requirements on mandatory services versus discretionary services? Because we are finding a situation where if some of the mandatory services were not ring-fenced, some councils would not be in a position to fund those very same services.
I think we should be honest and say that even with the current ring fencing, and there's over 300 ring fencing applying to over £12 billion of money that's given to local government, many councils have been forced to make the decision to move money from the ring fence to prop up services in people areas like children's and adults and temporary accommodation and other places. And so I think we need to be honest about the actual state and how it feels on the ground, and that should be our starting point. Because if we don't do that, we're not facing up to the real lived crisis in local government, nor are we kind of realigning it to the multi-year settlement and getting local government back on its feet by the end of the Parliament. So I think being realistic about where we are, I think that's quite different though, if I can be honest, around a theoretical debate on what's the meaning of life for local government, where I don't think the time is there to do that. I think the urgency to repair the system is now. I think the needs and resource assessment that we're doing is fundamental, and for some councils will be life-saving for them. I think the work we're doing on redistribution is important, but also I think the very open way that we have really been working in collaboration with the sector to understand what are the actual cost drivers that are forcing local government to the edge in some places, or where the cost drivers are just having a different impact on different councils. So the needs and resource assessment that we're undertaking, by way of an example, will take into account issues like deprivation, the cost of rural service delivery, daytime population booms in large cities where they have a huge employment base but maybe not a residential base in that area, where there are different component parts that do have an impact on the cost of operation that at the moment the current system isn't picking up in the way that we would want it to. There's room in this process to address that.
But do you feel that you're talking about increasing local government funding when you are seeing some councils spend almost 50% of their housing budget just on temporary accommodation to sustain that, when you are seeing rural councils spending more and more on transport for SEND provision just to ensure that those children get to school, when you are seeing some councils essentially coming back to government year in, year out for additional support. Clive Betts mentioned at one of our sessions, it shouldn't be called exceptional financial support because there is nothing exceptional about it. It's almost becoming a cycle for those councils not to go under and not to declare bankruptcy. So going back to what does the government see the vision of local government and how will that be funded going forward?
I mean, I'll say, for context, the settlement this year was £69 billion, £5 billion of that was new money. So there is new money going into the system. That's not to say that the demand isn't going up as well. It is going up, and in some places it's going up significantly. But the response from government cannot be that we continue to pay more and more for a system that is providing worse outcomes for local people. We've got to get ahead of the underlying problems. So take temporary accommodation, for example. Temporary accommodation is not the result of council failure on housing, it's a result of a failed housing market. It's a result of no-fault evictions, it's a result of lack of supply. And so to deal with temporary accommodation, we've got to get to the back and actually build a housing market that can support local people to live in a safe, decent and affordable home. Children's services is another example. Many county councils pay huge amounts on home-to-school transport for sending young people further away from home, when actually I think most parents would want mainstream provision to be better than it is. But it's going to take time to build that mainstream provision back up. And equally, children's residential care. You know, when austerity first started over a decade ago, many local authorities took the decision that it was cheaper to go to the private sector, because at the time it would have been cheaper, and to withdraw that public sector direct provision. But now what we see is that private sector providers are charging in some places £45,000 per head in profit.
So on that then, Andrew Pike, when he came before our committee, he said and asked, is local government just a central government agency that we want to deliver services at low cost as possible? You mentioned the issue of private sector, in some cases, ripping off some councils in terms of the fees that they're charging. So going back to my question around local government, what do we want local government to do on the tin? Would you say that it's an arm of the government to deliver those effective services at a lower cost?
I think low cost, from my perspective, isn't the way to frame it. I think best value is the way to frame it. Because if all we do is look at the underlying cost, we do end up in a situation, like 10 years ago, where local authorities withdraw from direct provision of residential care for children, go to the private sector because the unit cost is less, but actually the outcomes are worse. And surely as public sector providers, all councils have responsibility to make sure that they are providing decent public services as well as cost-effective public services. And it's that balance that we want to strike.
How do we know it's cost-effective, Minister, when a number of councils haven't reported on their accounts for many years and the auditing is not in a good place, to the point where the whole of government accounts were not able to be presented because of local government auditing and delays there? That's
why I made it a priority. For me, a lot of this work is not like retail politically. You know, I'll say most people, when they're kind of speaking over breakfast, do not talk about local government audit. But everyone in the committee knows how important it is as the foundations of good public services. If you don't know where the money is, you can't direct it to priorities. And if you don't know what good is, how do you assess the impact of local public services? So within the first couple of months, we took measures to address the audit backlog. As a result of the December backstop date that we introduced, over 900 sets of accounts have been submitted. 400 were disclaimed, I accept, but that's 95% of accounts submitted to that deadline. We've now got a series of deadlines in place to make sure that we eventually catch up through the Parliament and beyond. But we are very honest. You know, we cannot undo 14 years of mismanagement of local government by central government, I should say, not by local councils themselves, in 10 months. It's going to take time to rebuild it. But I do think the work we are doing on the recovery grant and making sure we are getting money to the areas that need it most, the councils who are most vulnerable, having a different relationship actually makes a big difference. So rather than forcing councils to declare 114 notices, effective bankruptcy, we have a more productive relationship where we work together and we do support councils to address the underlying issues. And that matters on intervention, but it also matters on exceptional financial support as well. And I take the point that we have had a higher number of exceptional financial support councils, 30 in total, but that is in the context of hundreds of councils. And I think hadn't we have taken the action on the recovery grant, £600 million of money, the biggest beneficiary was Birmingham. The council actually with the biggest percentage increase in their core spending power was Blackpool. You know, that shows you just how much we are directing money to councils that need it, most of those high levels of deprivation and their historically low tax bases.
Do you feel that more councils will come forward for exceptional financial support? Obviously, we can't forecast what's happening. Most councils have set their budgets in February. Council tax bills have been issued. Do you feel that the funding package that government announced last year will be enough, or will you be seeking to get more for local government in the forthcoming spending review?
Well, our view is that the funding settlement of the £69 billion is enough as a bridging settlement, if you like, to take us to the multi-year settlement. The challenge that we all have is to make sure that by the end of the multi-year settlement, given how much churn is in the system, because we've got the needs and resource assessment on one side, but also members will know we've also got a huge programme of local reorganisation at the same time, where the underlying finances of those local authorities are critical to balancing the overall system at the end of the Parliament, which will be the third year of the multi-year settlement. And so all these moving parts have to align to make sure that at the end of the process, local government is in a stronger position than we inherited.
Well, I just add on that, I mean, people always ask about Section 114. I mean, we, exactly as the Minister said, we speak to councils the whole time. We say to councils, if you're in any risk, come and speak to us and my teams and speak to the ministers. We are not aware of any council that is imminently issuing a Section 114 in this financial year. It is just worth reminding us all that 114s happen for a range of reasons and can happen because people make mistakes in accounts. Now, we can't predict whether someone will find a mistake in an historic account, but in terms of 114, because they are unable to balance a budget in 25-26, we are not aware of any council.
So it's reassuring to know that there are no councils within your radar that you are actively worried about at this present time.
That's not to say that we're not supporting councils. You know, the relationship that we have developed is one of collaboration. And so some councils, and we are reviewing all the time our approach to support and intervention. And there are councils who will have best value notices issued because we do have concerns about governance and finance in some places. There will be some local authorities where we have to take even more intervention, whether that's through the appointment of envoys or commissioners, to make sure that councils get on track as quickly as possible. But we do that in a way that is collaborative, and I hope that members do see in the tones of parliamentary updates, in the tones of letters that local MPs will receive, and written ministerial statements, that we are genuinely trying to build a relationship where we work together through what are very difficult issues for a lot of local authorities. But as I say, these are structural changes that we're making to the structure of local government, to the financial makeup of local government, and the intention is, by the end of the multi-year settlement, that local government is in a much better position than it started.
Thank you. Shaba.
Thank you, and thank you, Minister. It's been really helpful to hear some of your thoughts on that. As someone who's served as a councillor for over 10 years and also as a cabinet member, really interested to hear some of your thoughts on this, because one of the things that we found during that period is that essentially local government balancing the books became about how do you make the cuts in non-statutory services in order to ensure that statutory services are able to float. So, alongside the multi-year settlements, do you think, first of all, that those go far enough in terms of enabling councils to fulfil their duties, but recognising that the majority of the public actually, in terms of their interactions with their council, will be around those non-statutory services? How do you see that progressing in the next few years? Because if the case will still be that in order to make the books balanced, to kind of really look at how they manage their finances, the only answer is to continue to kind of look at those non-statutory services, leisure, all those things that people really wish to interact with. Do you not think that going forward that could create further problems down the line? And is there any work being done to try and balance that overarching way of approaching finance within local government?
Well, I think there is an organisational challenge that councils have about how do they balance the competing interests, because the councils will want to deliver good neighbourhood services for their residents, coupled with the statutory services that they have to maintain. I'll also be honest and say that there is a political challenge here as well, which is, as you rightly identify, the number of people that receive adult social care and children's services as targeted intervention in the overall population is actually a very small number of the population, but everybody receives neighbourhood services. And I would say that there is a disconnect between the council tax that people pay and what people believe they get in return for that council tax. I would say most people think they pay council tax for the roads to be repaired, the bins to be collected and the litter to be picked up off the street. And I think in there is the disconnect. And I do think that the reduction in neighbourhood services and the increase in council tax has led to a breakdown of trust and confidence from the public about the ability of public services to be able to deliver good public services. And I think that that is something that we have to rebuild, but it will take time, like a lot of this project will take time to do. But I think we can make inroads, providing for the fact that we get money to the councils that have been most severely impacted by the last decade or more.
Back on that. So I think I completely agree with that, Minister. I just wanted to sort of get a bit of clarity when you say that we need to rebuild that trust. Alongside the multi-year settlements, is there anything else that you think that could help us to enable councils to do that going forward?
So, well, the multi-year settlement, in a way, is only kind of one component part of a bigger project to rebuild the system and to shore up the foundations. And what a multi-year settlement does is to give confidence and the ability to plan ahead. So where councils need to think about their new operating model, it gives time to work through that transitional arrangement. Where there are more kind of structural changes in direct services like children's services or adult social care, it allows over a 3-year period to think about investing upfront to get savings at the back end in terms of early intervention and prevention and public service reform. So that's where we see the benefit of a multi-year settlement. But a multi-year settlement is only as good as the money that's put into it in the end, because councils need to be funded sufficiently to deliver the baseline of services that they're expected to do. And I would say that over a period of time, there has been a disconnect between the distribution from central government and the need presented at a local area. And the most obvious example of that was the decoupling of deprivation as a driver of demand for public services. And I think really for the first time in a long time, it's only been the recovery grant that has taken into account the deprivation and a historic low tax base is a significant issue for local authorities in being able to meet the demand and resource issue at a local level. Now, we said that the recovery grant was a one-off intervention. This was a bridging position to get to the multi-year settlement, but it was an indication that we believe that deprivation is a significant contributor to demand for local public services, coupled with low tax bases, means that central government does need to do more in terms of redistribution and acting as an equaliser to the system.
And just building on that, I mean, the other things that the Minister mentioned in terms of what we did in the first settlement, which obviously happened very soon after the new government was in place, I mean, I think everyone agrees on the kind of 4 big challenges of adults, children, social care, homelessness, temporary accommodation and special educational needs funding. And within that settlement, we very much began, but something on each of those things. If you take children, social care, spending on prevention has plummeted in the kind of previous decade. At the same time, more children are entering into the care system, and as the Minister has said, the market is not functioning very well. So the government has already taken action in terms of the market. There is a Children and Families Bill which is going through this building right now. That will introduce powers to, if necessary, basically cap the costs of markets to avoid councils being charged literally millions of pounds to look after a single child. And there was a very well respected study done by Josh McAllister, who is now obviously in this house, which set forward quite a compelling case for investment in children's social care and to make what I think is a very well evidenced report about investment and decreasing costs. So there are things we can do to improve both the value for money of what we spend, both get controls of markets and crucially deliver better outcomes. I mean, just again in children's social care, the outcomes when children are put into foster care versus going into residential care are much better. We've seen a significant decrease in the provision of foster care over the last decade, which the Department of Education are now trying to address. So as well as all the distributional things that the Minister has talked about, there is action underway on both the kind of service provision and on markets. That's just in children's social care. There's similar things going on in homelessness and in SEND as well.
That's good. We're going to come back to cost pressures and funding reform. I just wanted to bring in Gagan on NIC and new burdens.
Thank you. Obviously, we've had an increase in employer NECs as of the budget last autumn, and part of the new burdens philosophy was to cover the costs. The LGA has reported that the direct costs will not be fully covered by the 515 million that was announced for additional support. I think they've estimated direct costs locally for local authorities as 637 million, with an extra 1.13 billion of indirect costs. What else will the government do to protect cash-strapped local authorities from this burden?
Well, I'm going to say that I'll let Nico talk about how we arrived at the distribution of NICs, if it's helpful to the committee. In terms of the overall allocation, though, we do take, and you expect to say this, the allocation to local government in the round. And, of course, on that basis, there has been £5 billion of new money into the system. And so most councils in most places have seen an uplift. There's been no council seeing a decrease. And so on that basis, it's our belief that there is sufficient room in the system for councils to be able to absorb that. On the point around indirect costs, which we did hear from the LGA quite strongly, I'll be honest and say it's just impossible to know what number is in practice. There is not a clear line of sight, council by council, about how much that indirect cost liability would be attributed back to the local authority. Some councils will have contracts in place that wouldn't allow a provider to pass on that cost even if it wanted to. There are some areas where the provider actually has a reasonable headroom of profit, where it's not an unreasonable expectation that some of that profit will be forgone to pay for the additional employer costs. And so it's very, very difficult to know how much of that will come through the system overall. Notwithstanding that, the money that was put into the system is still far greater than that in any case. So it's our belief that in the round that we have sufficiently provided funding into the system.
So is the LGA wrong then when they say that the direct cost associated with it is higher than what government's given in additional support?
No, but I mean, I take the LGA's figures on face value. My point is that coupled with the additional payment of over £500 million for NIC costs and the overall allocation of £5 billion, that in the round that there is enough money in the system to absorb that direct cost. I can ask Nico to talk about how we arrived at the calculation that distributed that money then within the system.
So just want to stay on the point about the difference between the figures that your assessment has suggested versus what the LGA who are on the ground say. So there's a discrepancy of over 120 million, which is obviously significant. Was a full assessment made about the policy change that was introduced with the employee NICs in terms of local government funding?
So what happens with the employee NICs is that the Treasury undertook an economy-wide assessment of the costs of the direct costs of that change, which was a policy choice. The approach that the Treasury took was the same as they took under the previous government, when the previous government did something similar. So it's a sort of well understood and consistent approach. We were then, as part of that for local government, allocated £515 million, which, as the Minister has set out, we then distributed. And I think we come back to, when you're looking at a £70 billion system, we don't look at every single input on its own. We look at the totality of it, and I think with actually 5.4 billion of additional grant announced as part of the spending review for local government, that in the round, in the way that the Minister said, in the kind of bridging for 25-26, we think there is sufficient funding in the system to enable the vast majority of councils to set balanced budgets.
So just on that then, did the Treasury run this past you before this decision was agreed?
Run what past us, sorry?
The NICs.
We work with Treasury in terms of providing data inputs, but the decision on kind of raising national insurance was obviously a tax matter, and that is obviously for the Treasury.
And in terms of the assessments?
Yeah, I mean, we worked with Treasury, but as I said, the methodology used is not a new methodology. It was the same one that was applied a few years ago as well.
Just coming back to some of the stuff around ring fencing and burdens and deprivation, Joe.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I think, Minister, you mentioned the bringing deprivation, how to calculate deprivation, and you'll know there's a few questions about how to do that in order to deliver the best outcomes. So I just had a couple of questions. One was on the inclusion of housing costs. Obviously, you'll know in some of our big cities, housing costs have accelerated massively. Is your plan to include housing costs so that deprivation is calculated after housing cost?
I mean, we're going into multiple deprivation. The only, I suppose, kind of direct instruction politically is that we need to go down to the smallest possible unit to make sure that we're picking up deprivation wherever it exists in the country. What we don't want to do is have such a high level of assessment of deprivation that we pick up quite big clusters, but we miss pockets of deprivation that might exist in coastal communities or in rural communities where there is deprivation to be found, but the system, maybe in some parts, doesn't quite pick that up. So the indices that we're going on the super output areas are population sizes of about 1,000. So that should pick up the deprivation wherever it exists. I can ask Nico to come in on the housing cost question.
So we haven't, I mean, it's one of the things we're looking at the moment. We've got a very good group of representatives from the sector, which we're working with very closely. And as the Minister mentioned, there are a number of issues, for instance, housing costs, for instance, daytime populations, transport costs, etc., which we could include within some formulas. We will set out more details of that in the next consultation document, but I think it's fair to say the sector has made kind of strong representations that they think housing costs should be included within it, and it's something that we're considering and that we will work with our ministers on and set out more detail on in our next consultation, which should come after the spending review in about mid-June.
So just to, I mean, it's good to hear about the trying to find those pockets of deprivation, even in areas where that might show up. But housing costs, obviously, if you take London as an example, it dramatically shifts the funding formula. Yep. And if you look at poverty after housing costs, it rises significantly. So you can understand why people are concerned if that won't be taken into account, that you could see I think the previous Prime Minister talked about, mucking around with the formulas to move money from deprived areas to wealthier areas, and we want to make sure that is properly dealt with.
I think, we have definitely heard that from the sector, and as I say, I think it's one of a number of things that we're looking at, and we will come back. But I think we totally understand.
It's a spending review allocation that will drive that decision, or a needs-based assessment?
I think in coming to what ministers think are the kind of right balance of things within the formula, there are a number of things. So we've had lots of representations on places like London or Birmingham that receive lots of daytime visitors. We've had strong representations from people saying you must include housing costs. We've had strong representations from people in rural areas saying we need to take a greater account of, say, scarcity. These are all and there are many more examples of that. We will want to look at them in the round, and we will set out in the consultation in June the appropriate place. But I guess to reassure you, we have absolutely heard and understood the point about housing.
And I guess the final one on the assessment is on population. The 2021 census had some, in the middle of a pandemic, there will be population shifts that may not now be the case. How are you planning to account for actual population?
In terms of all of the data sets, or the baseline data sets, whether it's within our own department or the Department for Education or the Health Department, we want to use the most up-to-date and reliable, robust data possible. So that is the intention. And we'll obviously kind of come forward with the needs and resource assessment in the round. Just to reassure the committee, I want, from a political leadership point of view, for this to hold up to any scrutiny that can be offered by any part of the system. What I don't want is for any part of the system to believe that this is a double reversal of the type of political manoeuvring that you referred to earlier on, where different political parties move a finite resource from one place to another depending on the political will. We have started the consultation with Integrity, and we have said that we want to hear from the sector about where there are legitimate costs that should be taken into account in whatever is considered to be a fair funding system. And if it's not taken into account in the system, then it can't be considered to be a fair funding system. And so we've been open about that, and the submissions that we've had cover a huge range of different areas. Some quite small, so the kind of issue around the population base for deprivation has been a significant issue for, say, coastal communities and rural communities in particular. But also, as Nico has said, there have been cities that say our cost demand doesn't reflect our resident population, because we're a city with a huge office market, which means that our daytime population booms and we don't collect that in council tax. How do we reconcile the public service demand that is driving? And you'll hear that in London, you'll hear that in Birmingham, in Manchester and other places. And equally, on the other hand, rural councils who will say on an evidence-based assessment, it just costs more to deliver public services in our area because of the distance needed to travel from one appointment to the other, or to empty a bin from one address to the other. And wherever the evidence base supports the argument being made, we are keen to make sure that it's accommodated. Now, what weighting it's given is a separate issue in terms of the allocation across the system. But we started out with Integrity, and we'll finish with Integrity in terms of it holding up scrutiny.
Coming back to the issue of kind of cost pressures and service reform, question being, what are your proposed timings? I'm assuming that there are ideas coming forward around quite significant service reform in the key areas that we've been discussing so far. Interested in specific ideas on what those might be, but also the timings around when they might be coming forward. Is it before, with the spending review, after?
Well, some of the work is taking place now. So at a more localised level, working with the Cabinet Office on the Test, Learn and Grow pilots. And that's about understanding where place-based, hyper-local early intervention and public sector reform partnerships can just deliver better outcomes at a reduced cost. And so that work is ongoing. And that's £100 million that the Treasury gave in the last spending review. But we also recognise that time is not on our side to wait for pilot projects to come to evaluation and fruition when actually the demand is in the system. So we are supporting areas, for instance, Greater Manchester, where the 10 local authorities are working together to look at a public sector provider model in children's services on the residential side in a way that provides a ballast to the private sector provision that is increasingly just more expensive and in some cases not delivering good outcomes. And so that kind of real-time public service reform and partnership at a local level is working well. I do say, though, there is a huge opportunity because almost the biggest pilot for local government is the fact that a third of England is being reorganised. And it is an opportunity for all councils and all councillors to think about the council of the future that they're building and how technology can be deployed, how the workforce can be deployed better, and how we really kind of bake in local place-based public service provision at a neighbourhood level. And I think if we do that, there's a huge prize, but we also recognise that that is a huge project to undertake as well. So an example of that might be where local areas are looking at, say, adult social care. We have a commitment in the English Devolution white paper to align ICP boundaries with mayoral combined authorities, and we're on with that now. But it would make sense then to have co-alignment of the adult social care boundaries as well, from a partnership point of view. Now, this is not creating super county councils. It's not about the mayoral combined authority taking on adult social care at all, but it is about saying for the new unitary councils that are created, there is a partnership model to be had there, I think, where those councils can collaborate, where they can work together, where they might want to provide cross-commission specialist services, for instance, that aligns then to the ICP health boundaries, that when you kind of bake in early intervention and prevention and work at a neighbourhood level, I do think we begin to get the savings out of the system and have better outcomes as well. So there is a huge opportunity in those areas that are being reorganised, but there's learning right across the system taking place.
And on some of the service reform, I mean, in the settlement that we've just delivered, we put in an extra roughly 250 million to begin some children's social care reform. There was £1 billion of funding announced on special educational needs funding. There was an extra 230 million on homelessness. If you look at the kind of, I mean, I doubt anyone's done this, not even me, read the kind of actual detail of the spending review documents, but in the stuff there is a clear signal about the need for this future SR to make further progress on children's social care, on SEND reform, on homelessness and temporary accommodation. And so I think kind of through the combination of the spending review and then our follow-up consultation on funding reform in mid-June, through a combination of those two things, I think you will see kind of where the government is headed kind of across all of those services. Obviously on adult social care there is a slightly separate review being undertaken by Baroness Casey, but I think as the Minister has said, our consultation will go out in mid-June after the spending review, and then in the autumn we will then be able to set out a kind of multi-year 3-year funding settlement for local government, which will contain a lot more detail on kind of reforms of those big services.
Just on a Baroness Case review, when's that due to come back to ministers? I know that's and health, but
yeah, I mean, I think from memory, I think the final report is due, I think, in 2028. But there is an interim date of, I think, 2026. But the final report, I think, is due 2028. I'll triple check that, and if I'm wrong on those dates, we'll clarify with you.
And specifically on the issue of SEND, it sort of seems like almost every week there's an inadequate report coming back from a county council or council in the country on this issue, which leads to the question of what's your assessment of the systemic challenges that are faced? Do you agree that it is about the system, and what are the identification of some of the solutions that you're bringing forward, rather than it being about individual failure, council by council? Interested in your views on that.
I mean, all the evidence says that the number of young people who need specialist educational support outside of mainstream provision is increasing all the time, and the cost of that provision is increasing too. And I think where there is a coming together is that I think that most parents want their child to go to the local school, and for that local school to have the capacity and the skill set to be able to deal with a range of educational needs in that school. And almost where the exception is specialist support, if that can't be provided, but specialist support in the right way, not because you have been displaced because the mainstream support isn't good enough. And honestly, in too many schools, the hollowing out of staffing numbers has had a huge impact on the ability of schools to deal with children in mainstream provision. where teachers don't have the time to do that, where many schools now don't even have classroom assistants to be able to team and ladle the need in the classroom, and where many schools don't have the specialist supports needed for young people either. And actually, and it has been a shift over the last 10 years, the role of the local authority, if you like, as local education authority providing central specialist services, in large part has been affected by the academy system and the fragmentation system overall. So that there is a rebuilding needed within local government to be able to provide that support and within the school system. And if we do that, we will then reduce the cost, but probably more importantly, actually, just deliver better outcomes for the young people who are going through the system.
Can I jump in? Is that right? The Society of County Treasurers said that there's a direct connection between cuts to universal services for families at the start of austerity with the previous government and the current crisis in SEND and social care. So could you just touch on how, going back to how we're going to sort of build this sort of sustainability in our government, how are government going to support preventative services like supporting families in the first instance without relying on ring fencing and grant funding?
Well, I mean, in a sense, we probably ought to avoid trying to kind of reinvent the wheel. I think there were more than adequate examples in the last Labour government of what good early intervention, family-based, neighbourhood-based intervention can be. And maybe the problem in politics is that takes a long time to prove the concept. By the time that young person kind of grows into teenage years, into adulthood, but it absolutely makes a difference. And it leads to stronger economies and stronger communities as well. And I think what we've all seen is that the removal of support for things like the Sure Start centres has had a material impact on the outcomes for young people, and also the readiness, if you like, the school readiness of young people going then into primary and secondary school. And there are separate issues then about the fragmentation of the system and how siloed some parts of the system can be. There is not a whole system kind of system built around young people and the families and the communities where they live. The new family hubs will go some way to do that, but in the end we need to better align, I think, the authority and the legitimacy of local government to be the leader of place. And I think actually, aside from the financial crisis in local government, the thing that I have seen over the last 10 years is that local government's authority has been diminished. I think kind of referring to councillors as essentially the volunteer army, scout group leaders esque view of local government is not just it's not fair, it doesn't represent at all the level of responsibility they have. I think then if you look at the fragmentation of place-based partnerships like the local area partnerships or the local strategic partnerships as they were, where local government held the ring and brought partners to account around the table around a single plan for the place. In some areas they still exist a bit, but in many areas they don't exist at all. We've got to rebuild that whole architecture in the system from the top in terms of across the whole of the local authority area to make sure that public services are aligned around a single plan for the place and the people who live there. But it really has got to be rooted in the neighbourhoods where people live. And I think if we can do that, we begin to get to a better system. And without sounding like a broken record too much, it will take time to undo that 14 years of going backwards. But I think we are building the foundations for it.
On to financial distress. Clive.
Right. Section 114. It's not really a solution, is it? It's simply transfer the problem from today to tomorrow.
Well, thankfully, we haven't had any Section 114s this year as a result of financial distress, although we do touch board every day that hasn't happened yet, because we recognise that the system is very fragile. But we also recognise that we have had more exceptional financial support cases that we have supported because of the different approach that we have taken. Now, our view is that in terms of financial distress, with the support that we're giving on the recovery grant, on the overall investment into local government this year that takes it to £69 billion, and then the work that we're doing not just on best value but on support with the LGA and capacity for local leadership, that we are getting to a better place. But you'll know, Clive, from your experience, we've got to address the underlying structural faults in the system to make sure that money goes out the door to the places that need it.
But if 114 is avoided by simply allowing local authorities to capitalise, again, that simply transfer the problem. And I just wondered how that fits in your discussions with the Treasury about the Treasury's directive to other departments now, particularly health, that they shouldn't use capital for revenue purposes, because that's been going on for too long and has created a backlog of under-capital investment.
I think councils are all in different positions. I think there definitely will be examples of councils that have sold everything they can sell by and large. The libraries have gone, the youth centres have gone, the short start centres have gone. Any kind of low-hanging fruit in terms of operational premises like depots have been rationalised a long time ago, and they are at the end now of being able to. At the same time, they probably exhausted their reserve levels too. There will definitely be councils in that category, and I would say that there will be an overlay of councils in that category who also have historically low tax bases and high levels of deprivation too. And there was a perfect storm brewing there that we're trying to address with the recovery grant and the multi-year settlement and the needs and resources work that we're doing too. And it will go a long way to do that. But equally, there will be councils who actually haven't made those decisions to move to a future operating model that is just more efficient, and councils do need to do that. And there will be councils who legitimately want to be able to capitalise the transformation costs up front to get the savings out at the back end. So I think we need to be mindful, I suppose, that councils are in different positions. And what the EFS process allows, because every council gets a named person in the department that works with them very, very closely, we also work with SITFA in terms of the analysis that they undertake for individual councils. That does give us a very granular level of insight into councils that we can support. And I would say that all of the cases on EFS this year have been appropriate, proportionate, and have been the right thing to do.
Right, so just going forward, two issues. Where councils have used capital or borrowing to fill a hole in their revenue finances, is the intention of the new settlement to ensure that authorities do not have to continue doing that going forward?
Well, I would say that if it works, it probably should be an overlay, really, which is the multi-year settlement will allow councils to be able to plan for the medium term for the first time in a decade. In that planning and being able to step back from the immediacy of setting an annual budget that just holds, there will be councils that say, actually, over that 3-year period, we do want a transformation programme in adult social care, for instance, or children's services. But to fund that transformation programme, we need upfront capital investment into the system to fund that new model. And the use of IT models is a good example of that.
Yeah, no, I get using capital for transformation, but the intention is that capital shouldn't continue to be used simply to plug holes in revenue budgets.
Yeah.
Okay. The issue then of the SEND deficits and the statutory override is quite key. I mean, it's getting a bigger number each year. So is there a plan now to deal with it? It's going to stop at the end of this financial year, apparently. So is it going to stop? If so, what's the debt that isn't currently on local authority accounts? What's going to happen to it?
Those are the type of conversations that are live conversations now about how we deal with that. So I can't go into detail about what the end will be, other than to say that we absolutely understand, one, the financial pressures that the GSG deficit is placing on local authorities, and also that if that whole liability were to transfer to local government as a cliff edge, that wouldn't be sustainable for many councils. So I can say we absolutely understand the seriousness of it, and also that we need a more sustainable position on it, and those are live conversations taking place.
Well, you can't tell us what the answer is. Could you at least indicate to us what the answers might be, the alternatives you're looking at?
No, because that would be giving you the answer that I'm not allowed to do. But we absolutely understand the pressures that councils are facing, and also that a cliff edge approach doesn't work for central government any more than it works for local government.
I just wanted to ask, obviously, in terms of exceptional support and distress, there are commissioners, and can you outline how many councils currently have commissioners working with them?
Oh,
if you don't have the figures, you can write to us.
No, most of the numbers off the top of my head on things like that, but I'll go back and check that. I mean, I will say on commissioners that we have taken, I think, a very pragmatic approach on commissioners. So you'll see that there has been a number of best value interventions and notices removed. Liverpool being one example, but we've also removed notices in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough Combined Authority, and also the West of England Combined Authority as well. But I'll be honest and say that there are councils who, for a range of different factors, either need a warning signal that things aren't okay and they're on our radar and things need to improve quickly. And you'll see those coming through every month or two. There'll be some as well who, where my belief is there wasn't an adequate transition really from being on the radar in terms of best value to having a more robust intervention, where it was either a flag being raised over here or absolute intervention over here, and something was needed that was somewhere in the middle. So in Tower Hamlets, for instance, we have tested for the first time an envoy model rather than just sending in commissioners.
Yeah. These commissioners can be quite expensive, would you not agree, Minister?
Well, I think any
that in a sense puts an additional strain back onto the councils.
It's probably less about the cost, it's more about what purpose is it trying to serve. Because if councils need direction and specialist support, then we should provide that specialist support in place. But if all we had before was to take over key parts of the council to achieve that, then it was a sledgehammer to crack a nut in some cases. And what the envoy model allows us to do is to have the backstop powers that commissioners can have, but they're not deployed up until the point the council demonstrates that there are no other alternatives. But by which point the envoy has been in place for a period of time, working in partnership to try and get it through that partnership level of support. So, but it's a new model, and I think we need to see how that works in practice. I also think that we need a whole system approach to intervention and peer support, and we are moving on to that. So the work that we do with the LGA and the contract with the LGA to provide that peer-to-peer support in terms of peer inspections and reviews, but also the mentoring type programs is important. We need to think then about the role of the new local audit office as a replacement for Offlog, and how that will fit in a system of accountability and checks and balances and early warning as well. And the plan is that by the end of this project, whether it's the soft support that the LGA provide, the hard support that we provide in terms of best value notices and intervention, or the early warning system in terms of the local audit office, that it will work in the end as a single system.
Just to say, there are 7 councils that are currently in intervention with commissioners, and ministers have also announced that they are minded to appoint commissioners in Spelthorne. So that if that decision is taken, that would take it to 8. Yeah, but it's 7 at the moment.
And then 2 with envoys.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Just coming on to early warnings and exceptional support, Joe.
Yeah, just to build on this, on exceptional financial support, how do you choose which councils receive EFS and how much they receive?
Well, we don't quite choose the councils as much as they choose themselves. So the EFS process was really about offering councils, an early conversation. So rather than kind of wait and hold back until you find yourself in distress and have to do a 114, far better that you speak to the department early and we can work together to see what you need. Because actually for some councils, they actually only needed a very light level of support in terms of capitalisation directives that didn't require a 114 to then be issued, but without the capitalisation they would have been forced to issue a 114. So just getting in early and having that relationship in place for many councils has been the difference. But it is more that councils will speak to the department that they believe that they are struggling to balance their books and that they need additional support.
Do you think councils understand that there's enough transparency in the system about different levels of EFS they might get and why they might come to the department?
Well, I mean, Nico can talk about the almost like the technical assessment that is done, because it's not just about whether we have a willingness to help. There's a full financial and technical assessment made at the local authority. Obviously, SITFA have a role in terms of that assessment. Treasury obviously have a keen interest in exceptional financial support agreements as well. But I would say that of the 30 that have been agreed, we have, I think, struck the right balance of proportionality. So we're not providing any more support than is absolutely necessary, but we are providing enough support that gives councils the ability to...
There are some councils that are coming back for multiple rounds of EFS.
That will always be the case, and up until we address the foundational problems in local government finance.
How long do you anticipate using EFS?
Well, to a point, how long is a piece of string? There are lots of moving parts to the system, and I won't repeat what I've said already in terms of the number of moving parts. But the hope and expectation is that by the end of this Parliament, so at the end of the multi-year settlement, the councils will be on a sustainable footing and they'll be able to balance their own books. But there'll always be, I would say, an exception to the rule. You know, whatever system you design, you can never account for a council that is at the extreme ends of any system. You always need a bespoke way of accounting for that.
Your goal then at the end of the Parliament would be to reduce the use of EFS because funding is more sustainable.
Well, what does good look like? That the vast majority of councils, in the vast majority of cases, are able to stand on their own 2 feet and they are sustainable in their own right. And the number of councillors who come to us for exceptional support are absolutely exceptional and around the edges, and it is a result not of the underlying funding tensions but of localised decisions that have led to an issue that needs to be resolved.
Exactly, and there are a range. There are a range of decisions. There are some, as the Minister has said, that have come to us where once we have undertaken the funding reforms, you would expect they would no longer require EFS, or they might need another year, but in the longer term they should be more sustainable. There are some councils that receive EFS that have got themselves into difficulties because of a commercial investment, and there are some cases of EFS. For instance, we had one a few years ago where a council had a big cyber attack and it had to do some rapid investment. So there are, as the Minister said, there will always be exceptions, why, and hence it's exceptional, but definitely in the longer term you would want to see fewer cases once our funding reforms have materialised. And to your question about do the sector know what to do, I think yes they do. I think every year we are engaged in many more conversations with authorities who say, oh, we might need exceptional financial support, and then it turns out that because of good work by officers that they don't. And I think the kind of transparency we have with the sector and the kind of relationship we have both at ministerial level and official level means that we have a kind of good understanding of where people are.
And your final question is your assessment. You mentioned the local audit backlog, so do you anticipate that with the local audit backlog reduced, that will help you in terms of your decision making on EFS?
Well, the backlog is only a rear view mirror, isn't it?
Yeah.
It only tells you what's happened, it doesn't tell you what's going to happen. And what EFS is about doing is to put councils on a surer financial footing for the year ahead.
You mentioned there could be things that you discover through the audit process.
Well, that is down to the relationship between the local authorities and their auditors. And it's also about rebuilding capacity in the audit market more generally. So those are mature and developed relationships, because there will be examples almost certainly in the system where councils could take action they haven't taken already if there was a better understanding of their financial position and their own accounts, their assets, their liabilities, etc. EFSO, as it stands, I wouldn't underestimate, I know this is quite a technical approach in terms of how we deal with it, but I wouldn't underestimate just how important the relationship is in some of this that gives councils the confidence to come forward. I think, hadn't we have reset the relationship with local government, and I'll be blunt, the previous government, I think, took a large degree of political pleasure in parading around councils that were in distress for public shaming. And I thought that was a plague on the whole sector, and I don't think that was the right approach. And just by resetting that relationship where we can give comfort to all local authorities, regardless of their political leadership, and there are more varied political leaderships around England today than there was a week ago, from a government point of view, we will support all councils of all colours in all parts of England to make sure that they are providing good local public services, and none of them should fear coming to the government for a partnership conversation about how to do that if they need support. And I think just having that reset of the relationship has gone quite a long way to reducing the number of 114 notices and having a more collaborative approach on exceptional financial support cases.
I want to ask a question about equal pay claims and obviously the impacts that it's had recently in Birmingham. How many other councils are exposed to such claims, and is the government doing anything to support those councils to avoid another situation like Birmingham?
So, from a sector point of view, we don't assess at the moment that there are almost structural vulnerabilities in the sector, but there will be historic liabilities that some councils have built up where historically men have been paid more for equivalent roles compared to female workers. I would say that most councils dealt with that issue quite a long time ago. In some cases, it'd be more than a decade ago. Part of the reason why Birmingham, which is the example that you pointed to, is in the situation that it finds itself in, where about 7,500 women have legitimate claims for underpayment, is because that has taken so long to be dealt with. And so we don't see that the situation in Birmingham will be replicated around the country. It's almost the opposite, really, that Birmingham is at the tail end of a problem that many other councils have dealt with earlier on. But that's not to say that there aren't localised issues where a trade union or a law firm acting on behalf of employees might not challenge the status of female workers against male counterparts in very particular roles. That can happen anywhere.
And just very specifically, so Unite's union says it won't accept the council's offer at the moment because it would leave 150 of their members £8,000 worse off, but Birmingham City Council says the offer would only negatively affect 17 people. Has the government offered to provide any independent support to help get to the bottom of that?
So there is an independent. I was actually on the phone to the leader of Birmingham this morning, and we're in regular contact about the situation there. I mean, first of all, I would say that we really appreciate the efforts of frontline workers to clear what has been over 30,000 tonnes of accumulated waste from the streets of Birmingham. I think the public health crisis that was in plain sight and developing, it's been no mean feat to address that, but it's happened because frontline workers have worked around the clock to make that happen. And I think they are owed our appreciation for that. In the end, though, that is a temporary measure to deal with a public health consequence of strike action, and we need to address the underlying cause of that strike action. It's not an option in Birmingham to continue the unequal pay of men and women, and so that has got to be changed. But the way that they reconcile that change is obviously subject to negotiations now between Birmingham as the employer and the trade unions and the employees who are affected. And I could say at the moment that signs are encouraging, but there is still quite a long way to go. It's encouraging because people are in the room talking, having meetings, and there are proposals on the table. It's encouraging because ACAS are leading that in terms of the independent support that can come in and provide that. And there is also, as far as I can see, a willingness on both sides to negotiate in good faith. And so, you know, if that holds, it's our hope and expectation that the strike action can be called to an end, that an agreement can be put to the members who are striking, and hopefully, with a fair wind, that agreement will lead to the support of the workforce. But as I say, we have got some way to go to get there. But I think it is encouraging that people are in the room with ACAS having those conversations.
And so I know that many councils still have issues of unsustainable levels of debt that you're looking at. Two of them being Woking and Thurrock. We just had some additional questions on them, obviously.
Thank you, Chairman. Before I highlight, just draw people's attention to my register of interests. Further to sort of the equal pay claim that Mayor mentioned, that we've got another legacy issue of debt. Without trying to go into the details of Woking, Surrey, Thurrock, Essex, obviously that are probably going to be the more guinea pigs of the reorganisation of how debt will be handled. Do you have an idea of what that financial support to those authorities to reduce those debt burdens will look like? When will it take effect? And would that cost, that debt write-off, come out of the local government budget itself or a Treasury wider cost?
So, I mean, there's quite a lot of that question that's preempting our position. I will say, I mean, first of all, we haven't yet agreed with individual local authorities, and I mean that in the round, as in all those going through reorganisation in the counties where some of the councils might have quite high excessive levels of debt. Nor have we agreed a final position with Treasury about the treatment of that. And the reason for that, and I wouldn't call the councils who are in scope guinea pigs in the way that he speaks to, but I would call them proof points in terms of addressing up front how we're going to deal with this in an open and transparent way, and also in partnership. And so part of the reason why it's difficult to be able to say this is a plan to deal with individual councils is because it is in large part dependent on the type of proposals that we get through the LGR process to understand what type of, what structure of councils are being proposed for a particular county. We know that some of the proposals will be recommending quite large unitary authorities, more 500,000, 600,000 in some cases, but there are counter proposals that we have seen that look for smaller unitaries of 300,000-400,000. Really, up until we see what the final proposals are, it's not until we get to the end of those negotiations that we're able to assess how that new unitary authority can deal with the transfer of assets and liabilities and workforce in a way that means it is a sustainable council that is being put in place. So these are live conversations. What we have said is that we're working in good faith. You know, that we do recognise that some of these debt levels are extremely high and that they need to be addressed in one way or another. And we also accept that the government has to have a role in that, but the extent of our role has to be worked through.
And in terms of timing, I think, as the Minister said, the reason particularly for Surrey going on an expedited thing on LGR was so that we could align that with the timetable for the spending review. So again, through the spending review and then the LGR proposals, we will be able to set out a proposal on that.
I may very quickly follow. I think timetable is quite important. So obviously, if proposals for reorganisation from across the country, particularly the South East and East Anglia, are submitted, yourself as a ministry need to digest that. We then have a spending review in June, and then a decision on reorganisation. That's a huge amount of work to do in a very tight timescale. For then, even after you've digested what local councils have recommended, you've got to then lobby the Treasury for that, because that will come with a significant cost. How is that possible? Do you think you can genuinely meet that timetable?
Well, I mean, in a way, it's not an option not to meet it, because if we haven't got a clear eye on what the new unitaries will be in a third of England, there is no way that we can have a local government finance settlement and a multi-year settlement that balances at the end without knowing what the architecture of those councils is going to be. So it's critical that reorganisation continues at the pace that it has. It's critical that we address some of the big issues, which is why, obviously, Surrey have a 9th of May deadline that we can address that as part of the spending review. But we don't shy away from the fact that for those areas in the Devolution Priority Programme, that they will have to submit by the 26th of September, and for all others that they will have to submit by the 28th of November. And the reason for that is to make sure that as we go into the first year of the multi-year settlement, that we are very clear about what the transitional arrangements are to go from the existing two-tier system to the unitary model at the end of that multi-year settlement. And so it is tight, and we absolutely appreciate that for local authorities and for the department, I should say, that this is no mean feat, but it is critical if at the end of the Parliament we want local government to be sustainable.
And just to reassure on I mean, I wouldn't characterise it, to be honest, as lobbying Treasury. I'd characterise it as kind of working in lockstep with Treasury on that. Given some of the size of the debts, it's been very close working over a number of years. And I mean, we are clear, and the Minister has written to leaders in Surrey to say that we will set out more information ahead of 26-27's financial settlement in terms of how we will support Woking to enable the local government reorganisation to happen. And we couldn't have done that without Treasury agreeing to that. So we are very much working as one with them.
Thank you. Andrew.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. The dominant theme of this morning has been obviously pressure on local government finances, and just want to take a step back. So the defining mission of this government is in its own terms is to grow the economy. My question is about business rates, because I'm interested in an update on the reset set for 26-27, whether you consider that to be a sort of pro-growth measure, and also how reform of business rates will interact with local government reorganisation.
I'll come in on the reset and I'll come in on multipliers.
So I think we think of the reset as just an integral part of the needs and resources formula that the Minister has set out already. So yes, that is all part of the consultation that we have already put out, that we are looking at now, and we will set out the kind of final proposal on that in June as part of the wider reforms of needs and resources. We've got kind of lots of very technical work underway with the sector. So I think that is absolutely key, and I think a large part of the redistribution that we will be doing is rebaselining the business rate system, and that allows us to move some of the acquired growth around the system. It was always envisaged when the system was introduced in 2014 that the reset would happen every 3 years. You have the incentive to grow, and I think we very much think that the fact that the reset hasn't happened for 10 years is means that the system has been allowed to get out of date. And absolutely, some local authorities, and I'm not blaming them in any way, but have acquired and then kept that growth for a decade, and that has probably led to some of the inequality in the system.
It's also just on the pro-growth element. So there is kind of the quantum, so how much is being asked of businesses to pay in business rates. Yep. But there's also a rebalancing of the business rate system to make sure that we better account for the online and on-street. And I would say that when we speak to our own constituents and we talk about the economy, I think most people think about the everyday economy. They think about their high streets, they think about their communities and how it feels in their place as their reference point. And so the work that we have just done actually received royal assent on the business multipliers will mean that for qualifying retail, hospitality and leisure premises, including national operators in a way that wasn't taken into account in the temporary COVID relief previously, they will see a cash reduction in the rates that they pay. And that will be self-funded in the system, by charging more on properties worth more than £500,000, which are primarily, although not entirely, but primarily your large warehousing distribution type centres that many of the online retailers will use. So in terms of pro-growth, I do think it's important that we root growth in people's everyday lived experience as much as the macro.
Thank you. Conscious that, as we've had a good discussion this morning, as we talk about equalising the system and making sure that all local authorities benefit, I'm interested in how we strike that balance in terms of what powers are given to local authorities over business rates. So keen to know a little bit more about the ambition to give local councils more power to set their own reliefs and multipliers. Is that part of the ambition for further reform?
It's not a piece of work that we're currently looking at. The English Devolution White Paper on devolution is trying to do two things. It's trying to widen devolution to make sure that every part of England has a route to further devolution. And it's also intended to deepen devolution. So to make sure that those areas that have existing mayors or combined authorities or are looking towards them have a clear path to building up the type of devolved powers that they receive. And so I think it is an important moment that Greater Manchester and the West Midlands together have now £1 billion of integrated settlement freedoms. There are another batch of combined authorities that are coming down the line in terms of South Yorkshire, West Yorkshire, the North East and the Liverpool City region. And that kind of financial freedom to move money around the system is very much where we want to be. I'll also say, though, that there is naturally a difference. I think many at a local level would want more freedoms, more flexibilities and the ability to change. The Treasury will always want to have the ability to look at business taxation in the round to make sure that the burden on businesses is assessed in an equal way across the country. And so we believe that by and large that we have struck the right balance, and actually the type of freedoms that mayors now will have in areas where they have an integrated settlement will kind of lead the way in that sense.
Thank you. And then final question for me, if I can, Chair. I'm very conscious that different local authorities, parts of the country, at different stages on this journey. Going back to business rates, we've got the reset, clearly an important moment. Is there an ambition for this Parliament, probably for the Minister, to go beyond the reset and to look in sort of bigger terms about a reform to this system, or is the focus just on the current reset business rates?
Well, I mean, I think the introduction of the two new multipliers is actually quite a significant change. You know, to have now the lower multiplier for retail, hospitality and leisure will mean a cash saving for many of the foundational businesses that are important for our communities. The other thing it does is to take away the cap on national multiplier operators. So under the previous COVID scheme, there was a cap on how much a business could claim. Now that meant that if you were a regional occupier of premises or a national occupier, you could only really claim for one or two at the most. Now just think about most high streets. They will have your opticians and your chemists and our national occupiers are actually very important as the kind of foundational businesses for the high street. And if they weren't there tomorrow, I think the high street would feel that. This new system does account for that. And so I think that is quite a significant change, actually. It's self-financing within the round, so it's got to be sustainable. But we think that's the right way to do that. And I would say when it comes to kind of challenging the system and modernisation, I think whether it's on the structure of local government itself, whether it's on devolution and where power sits and the creation of new institutions and political accountability, whether it's about the audit system, whether it's about the fundamental kind of financial foundations of the system, including how we assess need and how we assess money going out the door on the other side, and then the standards regime and the work we're doing on the local government pension scheme. There is a significant amount of modernisation and reform taking place in the system by government that is determined to change it. But the real test of this isn't just about balancing the books. That's the day job of our department. The real test is that in every community in England, that when people walk outside their front door at the end of the Parliament, that they see that things are materially better than they were at the start. And that's about the street being cleaned, the potholes being repaired, the street lighting working, people feeling safe, the park being maintained in the way that people have a right to expect. The small things that make a place worth living and a place feel more secure and give pride of place, in the end will be the test. The work that we're doing here is foundational to achieve that.
And the Minister's absolutely right for the stuff that's been introduced. at the budget, there was also a kind of longer-term document published by the Treasury called, I'm just looking it up, Transforming Business Rates, and so that is the kind of sets out some very initial thinking about what may come after the stuff that the Minister has just been talking about.
Thank you. Moving on to another reform, council tax.
Can I just do one follow up on the business rates reset, if that's all right? Just because I think this is an important point. It's going to become more important, which is over the past 10 years there have been the country is incredibly economically unequal geographically, and that's a real problem. And I appreciate that we have to account for that. But actually, probably the biggest difference between councils that have managed to grow their business rates over the past 10 years and not. Good chunk of that difference is attitude. Some councils have actively gone out and tried to encourage investment in their local area, worked to grow, do everything that this government believes they should be doing in order to grow their local economy and then contribute to national growth. There are some councils that have done the complete opposite of that, deliberately tried to block investment in their local areas in order often to make their life slightly politically easier by appealing to some people who basically just don't like new building in their local area. Is there not a fear for a business rates reset that we basically are taking money away from the kind of pro-growth councils, such as Manchester being a great example, and giving it to those that oppose investment, particularly given, after what we've heard from some people in the Reform Party over the last week, they are actively going to go further and faster in trying to block investment in their local areas.
Yeah, I mean, on business rate retention, by and large, which I think is in the growth sense, is coupled with the revaluation. I mean, the revaluation needs to happen, and it was always intended to happen. It's just that the previous government decided that it wouldn't happen. And so whatever tax system, it should be based on the most up-to-date, reliable information, and the tax system should reflect that. And I think when it doesn't do that, there will be winners and there'll be losers in the system. I mean, that's quite different, though, than having a system of incentives where councils who are willing to take difficult decisions and who are willing to invest up front do see the upside and the benefit of that too. Now, the business rate retention schemes were meant to be that. I think the evidence base is very mixed about whether the business rate growth in that area has been directly attributed to the actions taken in that area versus areas that were already economically quite healthy anyway, continuing to grow. And there will be a relationship between areas that are that were always kind of in our modern history good, solid places where the economy was stable. You overlay that with good political leadership that's willing to make tough decisions, and growth comes as some of that. But I do think the system has to account for areas where you have the same political intent and the same political energy, but they don't have the same underlying business rate base to build from. And the system at the moment doesn't account for that well at all, actually. You can work in a post-industrial town, a coalfield community or a mill town like mine, and you can work as hard as somebody in the most affluent part, but the economic advantage of that effort is not equal.
I think the question is about incentives. So I suppose my point is, when you're looking at the way that you're going to approach this reset, are you going to be looking at how you can ensure, both with this reset and then thinking about future ones, you can ensure that there is still a strong incentive in the business rate system to encourage people to try and attract investment in the local area?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the sort of thing we want to do, and that will slightly be determined by how long we say until the next reset, right? Because the longer you have, I think some people would argue, the more of an incentive there is. If you reset it every year, there's not much of an incentive to try and grow your things.
I suppose the other point is you'd have to completely reset it, right? Like the extent that you do a reset could also encourage incentive.
Yes, it could. I mean, it could. I mean, I think, as the Minister said, I think there is. I think the extent to which the business rates retention system has led to incentives, I think, is quite questioned by the sector. I think lots of people say a version of what you've said, that it does encourage people to do it. But as the Minister said, I think when we've looked at the evidence, a lot of people who benefit from the current system, a lot of places you wouldn't necessarily describe as that pro-growth in terms of like their house building statistics or whatever. But of course we want a business rate system that has incentives in there. I think there might be a case in the longer term, once we have got through these sets of reforms, to think again about what a proper incentive is within the system and what you want local government funding to the funding system to incentivise, whether it be house building or growth or whatever.
Thank you. Sorry, Chair, I spent a lot of time on the question that wasn't mine there.
Sorry, just on that then. So are you saying essentially we're going to have a series of sort of rolling resets? Because again, you'll go back, if you go back to when business rates was introduced, the government did promise a big reset 7 years after. That's never happened. The proposals that ministers have, and I'm assuming you're working with Biz colleagues on this for 25-26, is that going to be a one-off, or do you envisage this to be sort of evolving?
We haven't reached final decisions, and we're still looking at consultations, and we will have another consultation. But I think the kind of fundamental principle of everything we want to do in the reform is to make sure that the system is updated. That means updating population statistics. It means always, not every year, but a kind of sensible period updating formulas, and it means resetting any incentive that you have. Again, back to the comment there, you wouldn't want to do it annually because that wouldn't be much of an incentive. So the question is, what is the right period between resets? And we'll be setting out more details of that in the consultation.
I mean, I would say that there is a transition that I think is pretty explicit in the white paper, which is about moving to strategic authorities that are basically the arm of growth, coupled with a reasserted local government that is the arm of public service reform and early intervention. And if you think that kind of growth and reform being two sides of the same coin, the freedom of removal of ring fencing, having more integrated settlements, but then within the freedom to move money around the system on things like transport, on skills and things like that, will give many areas new powers and levers over the system that they haven't previously had. And I would say actually for many areas that is more of an incentive even than business rate capture through a delayed reset or any other measure.
Yes, just looking at council tax more generally, you've said in the past that council tax is unfair, regressive, and has increased significantly over recent years with no improvement to services. And that is one of the reasons why that this is a disconnect has a real danger to the democratic process. Do you think the government should think more about significant changes to the way the council tax system works?
Well, I mean, I think all those comments that I assume was made in opposition are supported by the evidence. In terms of the unequal nature of council tax, it's a matter of fact that areas with lower tax bases have to charge more per Band A, Band B properties than areas with more affluent properties in higher bands. That's a matter of fact. The relationship between household value and household income and the disconnect is a matter of fact, and how that features in lower income households versus higher income households is evident. So I think it's always been accepted that council tax is pretty imperfect, but I think most people would say but it's still pretty good in large part. One, collection rates are high. Secondly, it's understood by the public. People know what it is. And I think coupled with a fairer redistribution that puts less of a burden on the individual council taxpayers, where central government is acting as the equaliser in the system, I think it becomes more tolerable. In terms of the direct question about is there a plan to look at this in the round, I would say with the work that we are doing on business rates and the need and resource assessment and the multi-year settlement and the deprivation-based allocations, and then the structural reform to create new strategic authorities and the Third of England going through reorganisation and a new audit body coming in and the work that we're doing on a new standards regime and the work we're doing on the local government pension scheme and its investment pools is a lot of change to the system in a very short space of time. And I think we need to be careful here that we don't stretch ourselves so thinly. And the thing with council tax is there are quite easy and understandable criticisms of how it sits today. There are less clear-cut options for making it better that don't have consequences to the system. So there isn't a plan at the moment to look at council tax. I think the work programme of the department is busy enough, and it's important that we land what we've already promised.
If the if the busyness of the department is a reason not to kind of do big bang reforms, and I think as a committee that is scrutinising a lot of the work the department's doing, we fully appreciate that point. Is there not an appetite at least to look at some of the sort of smaller changes that could be done to improve the council tax system, whether that's looking at introducing new bands, changing the ratios between bands, giving those kind of powers to local councils, particularly to help alleviate pressures on the poorest households, which we know have just been so difficult for so many families in recent years.
No, I'll let Nico talk about kind of what the art of the possible might be, but I'll also say that in the end, there'll always be things that you could do, and you've given some examples there of the type of interventions that you could make. But there are no interventions on council tax that don't have consequences for somebody. As in, it is a system that has to generate an amount of money, and at the end of that, it still has to generate that amount of money. It does that you'll be trying to seek to move that burden around the system. And there probably are ways of doing that, but at the moment, the focus has got to be, one, on making sure that the work we're doing on the funding formula and the multi-year settlement holds. Because if we don't get that right, that will be fatal to local government over that multi-year period in the rest of the Parliament. So we're absolutely clear-eyed on that being the priority, and also then to take into account capacity with the rest of the system.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely right. I mean, I think there's sort of no work underway at the moment. The big thing with council tax is it obviously has impacts on a household level, and then it obviously has impacts at a local authority level. And it's quite hard to find a change that benefits both of those groups. So, for instance, some of the things you talked about there in introducing new bans, I mean, I think that's quite hard to do, one, without kind of primary legislation, and two, without a total revaluation exercise, which the government has ruled out. But theoretically, if it were to happen, the sorts of places that would gain from a new band are not the sorts of places that are hugely deprived. So there are sort of, it's not an easy issue to solve, I don't think.
I mean, final one on like what we assume would be a small, easy win. I mean, I wasn't born when the property prices were set that we used to evaluate council taxes. I mean, like, we've got lots of data. It's not a particularly burdensome task in order to redo it based on new property prices. Have you got a date in mind when you think we might?
No, there's no current work programme to embark on a revaluation, any more than there is about redrawing the council tax system. We get ideas and suggestions all the time about, wouldn't this make a good intervention? I'll be honest and say, I think with any system like this that is so established but also very complex, what can feel like quite a minor change on the edge of it can have actually quite a significant change by household and by local authority at the back end of it. If I give an example of the banding issue raised, so if you wanted to introduce a higher bands above band H, just to do that you would have to do a revaluation, because when the original revaluation was done, it just basically accounted for all values in excess of, but it didn't then break down the individual values of the properties that would allow you to build in new bands above it. And I think the capacity and the time and the political capital that would be needed to steer a revaluation would be so significant. I would think you would only really do it if you had a view that the system was going to change as a result of the revaluation. Like, it'd have to be part of a bigger project.
I suppose that's probably why I framed the question the way I did, is like, you know, the business rates reset. I know it hasn't been the time frame that was expected, but there was this is what we're working to over this date. I mean, surely a kind of long-term plan to go, obviously, we're going to have to look at the value of properties dramatically changing over time and use that to reevaluate 10-year programme, whatever it happens to be, is a reasonable kind of time frame to set out.
Well, I mean, from my perspective, the time frame that I'm working to is essentially about how do you rebuild the foundations of a system that was on the edge of collapse within the Parliament. And so the work we're doing on the structural reforms to local government is a significant project. I mean, to change a third of England's governance structures is not a simple thing to do in the best of times, but to do it when the financial foundations are so weak and when some of the debt levels are so high, in a way that balances at the end of the multi-year settlement, is a significant task. And we've got to get that right, and it's got to be landed in the right way for local people who are affected by it. On top of that, then, we're going to do a complete revision of how, one, we take into account needs and resources, and then how we allocate money around the country as equalisers to the system. That's a significant change to the system Then we're looking at changes to the business rate system on top. That is a lot of change in the system to land within this Parliament and land it well. And I think it's really important that when we set out to do something, we have a clear eye on our capacity to deliver it well. And with that becomes an obligation to make sure that we deliver it.
Just on that, Minister, you've got a situation where the government are rightly going to be building new properties, and you know those properties will be based on valuation offers of 1991. You've got a situation where everyone agrees that this is a regressive form of taxation. It is not fit for purpose. Successive governments keep ignoring this. It's the big elephant in the room. We are talking about reform and reset. Is this not one area where a new government with that strong mandate, that change mandate that we are talking about, is actually going to take this, you know, and actually look at something around this?
I mean, I don't accept it's the elephant in the room. If it is, we're all at the circus because everyone keeps talking about the elephant. It's just more about what are the priorities of the government. And the priorities of the government have got to be that we stabilise a system that is on the edge of collapse from the inheritance that we had. And that is evidenced by the audit backlog. It's evidenced by the number of councils that financially are just not sustainable. It was evidenced by the number of 114 notices. But then even beyond that, you know, the standards regime, the lack of an early warning system, getting that right is a priority of the department. And I think if you don't have clear priorities, then you don't have priorities. We could set ourselves so many tasks that we spread ourselves so thinly we don't achieve any of them. And I think that would be a failure to the sector, frankly. So there might be disagreements about whether we have chosen the right priorities, which I would accept. But I think the government saying that these are our priorities, I think is responsible.
Essentially, you feel that it's right to continue imposing a national approach to council tax increase, because that's effectively what's going to happen over the next few years with local councils.
I would say, and my honest view is that there are many councils that have been forced to increase council tax to the absolute maximum at every opportunity in a way that for some households has proven a significant burden. And in part, that has been driven by the previous government that actively took away revenue support grant from councils to be able to provide decent local public services, and the only place that those councils had to go was to council tax. Now, there's not a lot we can do about what we've inherited, that's been and gone, but we can do something about what we do going forward, which is why the work we're doing on needs and resources and the formula and the allocations to individual councils will provide that equaliser to the system that will mean that council will get the support finally that they deserve. I think that's the right approach.
Well, do you want to come in very quickly?
I did. So, Minister, we've heard that sort of you don't want to reform this due to capacity and concerns about positive negatives of revaluation. Would the government consider allowing councils more flexibility on council tax, including doing their own revaluation? They're democratic organisations, after all. If they do it badly, they can get voted out of office. They might have the capacity, whereas at the moment, the government says you don't have the capacity to do it, but you're then stopping others who might feel they have that capacity. Wales has done revaluations every now and again now.
Wales is a nation, it's not a council. I mean, there's a difference between doing it on a nation footprint and doing it council by council. On an issue like this that is so fundamental to the funding of local public services, and actually so fundamental to individual households in terms of the bill that's then passed through to households, I think as a government you either do it and do it well as a focused project, or you say it's not for now. And at the moment we're saying it's not for now, but I think the idea that we allow hundreds of different councils to run off and do their own scheme, I think wouldn't help the problem. I think it would probably add more confusion.
Lee.
Thank you. Morning both. So we've spoken about how the government can support councils through multi-year funding settlements, so giving cash. We've just looked at how we raise tax locally. So moving on to other income sources for councils. So should councils be seeking other sources of income, such as commercial investments, to get returns back on those, as an alternative from central government? So that's the first question, if I may.
So, I mean, I think from the infancy of local government in England, councils have always played a bit of a role in supporting local economic development. And I think many of the commercial assets that councils hold, they don't hold purely as commercial investments. They might have a commercial return on that investment, but they are primarily about supporting the local economy. So, the council that would operate a business centre or an industrial park and rent out the units, the starting point would have been about providing that economic support to the local community. We would warn against strongly councils almost having an investment arm to their council that is not their day job. Like, the council's day job is to run good local public services and to support their local communities and their economies. They might do that through local investments and they might receive a return on that investment, but they are not equity firms. That is not the job to go around and buy assets around the country that are not kind of core purpose, I would say. And actually a lot of the work that we are doing in support of councils in financial distress is in some part, not entirely, but in some part a result of councils that have taken the kind of enterprising route writ large. And I think that the chickens have come home to roost on those.
I don't think I would disagree with that, but if you've got an expertise, so you buy the expertise in as a council, then does that provide some safeguards around those concerns that actually councillors are making decisions on investments where they're not knowledgeable enough to actually make those, which is what resulted in some of the funding pressures from councils when the investments went wrong. But actually, if it was done in a way, as I said, with an investment service brought into a council, would that safeguard your fears?
Well, I mean, the first thing to say is that we have, over the last few years, changed the guidance, particularly around borrowing for public works loan boards, which says that we will not lend to councils who are borrowing to invest only
that
for
was
profit.
done under the previous government. Yeah. So, yeah. It's about, will the government consider that going forward now as an additional income source?
I mean,
but with safeguards.
There will be a number of councils who believed, and I would say actually a decade ago, they were almost directed to by the previous government to be enterprising, entrepreneurial and go out and make your own luck in the world. But there are consequences to that. Now, the message to local government, and I should say the relationship between central government and local government is one of trust and respect. So this is not about dictating, and it's not about telling councils how to do their jobs, but it is reflecting that a council's core purpose is about providing local public services and supporting their local communities and their economies. And as part of that, they may choose to have localised investments to support them in that core purpose. But the core purpose isn't that they are enterprising equity type investors that go seeking places to place money. And they may deliver some council services at the back end of it. That is a path to ruin, and we've seen that. But I think most councils aren't in that place. I think most councils act responsibly, that they absolutely understand that they are there for their core purpose, but they also understand that they have an important role to play in driving their local economies. And actually, whatever visit you do around the country, you will be taken to a local example where the council has invested in co-working spaces or industrial units, where if not for that investment, they wouldn't have the economic activity that they have. So I think we need to be careful here. We have to be clear about where the guardrails need to be, and that's where we started from. But let's not pretend that that's where councils are. I think most councils are doing a really good job. And actually many of them have been doing that in quite difficult circumstances.
And also with your guardrail point, I mean, I think obviously councils should bring in expertise if needed. I think the crucial thing and what we've seen in some of the councils where it has gone spectacularly wrong is that they were overly reliant on so-called experts and the sort of systems of accountability and scrutiny, both from the officers and from the local political leadership weren't there. So expertise, absolutely, but we need to maintain that sort of accountability and scrutiny of the experts.
Thank you. And then two further questions on income sources. So if I go to visit Chris in Milton Keynes, then I can pay 80p an hour to park, because the council can't increase it by any more than that, because that's their transportation budget. So would the government allow councils more flexibility in unring fencing what income is generated for? So for example on car parking. And then another one is in terms of fees that are set by council. So, for example, planning fees are set at a national level, but they don't. That doesn't recognise the cost pressures of living in Newbury, in West Berkshire compared to living somewhere up north, for example. So, just on both of those areas, if you could have some comments on that.
Well, Nico, come in terms of how it features in the round.
Yeah. So on kind of parking or what is known in the sector as sales fees and charges, in our consultation document that we published in December, we had a whole chapter on that and asked for views for the sector. So we'll be setting out more in the follow-up consultation in June. I think it's a very complex area, and different sales fees and charges are owned in different places across government. So I think kind of really doing some work on that is probably for the slightly longer term, but I think we are very open to kind of hearing and are in regular dialogue with people like the LJ on if there are any kind of obvious areas to look at. But I think we will set out more detail in the June consultation on it in the round.
And then does that include car parking charging as well?
Yeah, that would be within sales fees and charges. Yeah, exactly.
But the car parking is slightly different. I mean, you've got licensing, or tax and excise or whatever, and planning fees is set by your department. I accept those fees. But something like income generation from car parking, in Oxford it's £20 a day to park, whereas in Milton Keynes it's 80p, just because they can't spend any more money that they generate. I'm sure there are pressures in Milton Keynes, where that extra 10p an hour generated would really help, fill some gaps in budgets.
Well, let's consider that in the round, because I think what we can't do is to have a sales fees and charges policy that is about Milton Keynes car parking rates.
It wasn't. It was about the formula, isn't it? Of car parking income.
Lee, you should be taking a train to Milton Keynes.
Yeah. But my point is that we need to take that in the round, and as Nico said, there are so many different government departments that have a view on this, or even hold the ring on some of the regulations around it. That needs to be worked through the system, and then we need to have an eye on what it means for the fee-paying public on the other side.
I'm going to bring in Clive and then Chris quickly on this.
Right. Minister, I agree with your comments in your previous inclination that council tax is regressive. Indeed, you agreed with Michael Gove when he was Secretary of State, who said exactly the same thing. So, going forward, if we're not going to reform council tax as a whole for the foreseeable future, does the government have to have very careful regard to looking at future demands on councils and the need to have more finance? How much of that finance comes from council tax, which are regressive, and how much from central government funding, which can draw from more progressive forms of taxation?
Well, I mean, I think in there is our starting point with the work that we're doing on the funding formula, which is to accept, and I've said in this committee that it's a matter of fact that there are areas that have had to go to council tax in the absence of central government funding just to be able to keep up with demand. But even that's not enough anymore. And so there has always been a role for central government, and I think for too long in large parts of the country, and generally poorer, more deprived, more post-industrial, with lower tax bases, honestly the government have walked off the pitch. Now we tried to reconcile that a bit this year with the recovery grant, and that's a £600 million that's been directed to those areas with high deprivation and low tax bases. But we've also got to make sure that the main funding formula, in the way that we account for the needs in the local area, and that's population size, it's the number of young people, it's the demand for different services, alongside its resource pot to how much we can legitimately generate at a local level, then calls on government to act as an equaliser to make sure that all local authorities can deliver local public services. And I think what we have found over the last 10 years is that the government haven't been doing that. And so councils have had no choice but to increase council tax in the way that they have.
Right, so that's about better distribution between councils. Within councils, if there's not going to be changes to bands, could the government at least look to revisit how much support it gives to council tax support schemes? I mean, the last government effectively withdrew that and left councils on their own with it. So is that something the government could look at, to put money into those schemes, which will really help the poorest in communities?
I mean, I think it's a matter of fact that the localisation of the council tax support scheme for working age households has led to a genuine postcode lottery. I usually avoid using that word because it doesn't allow for local variation. It's legitimate. But on this front, it's a matter of fact that there are, you can be in a very similar financial position, have a similar household makeup in one part of the country and get a different level of support than you do in another. And for some people that is difficult. The cost of a national scheme, though, is not insignificant. I mean, this is £1 billion worth of investment that will be needed. to fund that. And so the question is, and these are live and legitimate questions, are you better to fund individual councils via the funding formula, or do you want to use the same investment to fund individual households at a household level? Or do you want to do a bit of both, but there are trade-offs then within that system? And these are all part of the considerations that we will be considering as we get through the next few months.
Just finally, in terms of more radical reforms going forward, one which the Treasury would absolutely hate, is to look at what happens in many Scandinavian countries where local government is guaranteed a certain percentage of national taxation paid to it, or central government funds a major local government service like social care, at least in advance of the KC review. Are either of those possibilities under consideration at all?
Not in the way that you describe it, which essentially the hypothecation of local income tax model isn't something that we're looking at.
Not at all. No talk to the Treasury, or even about funding, more funding for one particular service, which is clearly a major requirement of local government with virtually no choice about the demand it has to respond to.
I think it is very difficult for central government to make an absolute assessment of the cost of delivering services, given that councils' delivery models are so different and their cost base is so variable. I mean, that does make it difficult for government to then have a funding formula that can meet that, which is why we always take funding in the round. You know, we do take into account the needs and resources, and we take pressures in the round, and then we look to say, well, what can we do to be the equaliser in the system to make sure that all local authorities have enough to sustain their activities, which I think is the right way, and certainly the way that Treasury wants us to look at it.
Just on that, before I bring in Chris, Minister, so I think going forward, you think going back to the issue of council tax, and when that bill comes, and for many residents, they'll see the adult social care precept, which continues to go up year in, year out. Do you think it's right that central government are not looking at fully considering the cost of those demand-less mandatory services like adult social care, temporary accommodation going forward?
I mean, council tax in most areas is far in excess of what a local council spends on neighbourhood universal services anyway, just because of the amount of council tax now that's generated. So in terms of kind of the notional attachment or hypothecation of council tax to universal services with central government then funding targeted people-based services, doesn't tally at all with the funding pots that are drawn on to fund local public services. I think it's more of a question about how real is a presentation of that council tax payment on a council tax bill versus the actual spend on adult social care in that context. I think that's more presentational than factual.
Chris?
A significantly smaller scale than what Clive was just talking about, but most of the evidence we get is, of course, you should do of course, you should introduce a tourism levy. It's been a success where it's been a success. There were other examples where it could be. Is this something that you are now looking at giving the power to strategic combined authorities to be able to implement?
Well, I mean, ultimately, any tax like that is a decision for the Treasury and not for our department.
But you.
Well, on issues like this, our view.
There are active discussions with the Treasury on this.
On issues like this, our view is the Treasury's view. But we do reflect that there are mayors and there are cities in particular who are making the case for an overnight visitor levy, tourism tax, and there are a number of voluntary schemes that are already active in the country. But it is a matter for, well, one, it's for mayors and for local authorities to make the case, and it's for HMT to hear the case and make the decision.
Do you think it's... Go on, Chris.
Sorry, I was going to say, we'll see where the Treasury ends up, and I hope that they end up in pushing this forward, but I think there is one very specific example, probably where it's going to have the most impact, that is relevant to your department. And without wanting to speak on behalf of Bedford Council, I imagine there are many there who are incredibly nervous about the millions of pounds of extra spending they are going to have to find to support the brilliant universal project that this government has committed to, the extra pressures that is going to put on them. So do you not think that your department does need to urgently look at how a strategic authority can be implemented across that region, including Luton Airport, where there's going to be an increase in business rates, to ensure that Bedford Council isn't going to Mr Heslop in a few years' time and going, we're really struggling under financial pressure in order to do this and make sure there's a strategic authority in place that can support the infrastructure going in around that, so it's not all of the burden falling on Bedford Council.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe we don't start at the same point, but I think we finish at the same point, which is, I think, that there are arguments, and some, I think, quite strong arguments for a levy. And the fact that there are voluntary schemes in place says that in some parts of the country, but let's be clear, not all, that there is a coming together of local political leadership and local business owners to say that's the right thing for our area, and the voluntary schemes are in place. I mean, that's quite different though than the end of the conversation, which is our ambition to see universal coverage of strategic authorities around the country, to make sure that everyone has that level of governance, whether it's with a mayor or with a foundational authority, to get money out the door. And we've had many conversations about Milton Keynes and Bedfordshire and the economic potential there. Means it's an obvious candidate.
Do you think that the introduction of the universal project adds extra urgency, given the potential increased costs, to ensure that a strategic authority is in place across that geography?
I think that's certainly a fair case to make in terms of the economic impact that investment will have, and it's one that should be capitalised. And with more coordination across that sub-region, I think that feels better. I should say, though, there's no reason why local authorities in that area can't do that now with a foundation agreement as a first step to devolution. But to be clear, our ambition for devolution, and in particular devolution in that part of the world, is clear. And the arguments, Chris, that you have made over quite a long period of time in favour of devolution are heard, and also the urgency for devolution is heard as well. So we should continue that.
You'd support more bid areas, introducing their own form of tourism taxes and levies then?
So we moved on to more mayoral strategic authorities being created, not more tourism tax authorities. But the point was more about to capitalise on the investment in the new theme park, that actually a strategic footprint that really draws in the economic impact of that.
If all those new mayoral authorities decided to have additional business improvement districts with a local tourism levy, you wouldn't object to that?
Created more. Well, there is a route. Well, there's slightly different things. So the business improvement district that is done obviously through a localised referendum.
Yeah.
Is a route that's available to areas today. And actually, there are live bids that have come through the system since we've been in government. That we are
essentially they would have the mandate to do that if they balloted their members, which a number of them
Liverpool are introducing it.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean that's slightly different than the tourism tax in the way that is being requested for in other parts.
I think we've had a wide range of discussions. I think we appreciate your time this morning, Minister, and to you, Nico. These discussions will continue as we continue to look at the funding and sustainability of local government finance. Thank you for attending this morning. Order.